In this video, we'll set up a rig to create an art directable hero splash. So let's get started. So here we are in our last saved scene, and this is our 02 water splash scene. And as you can see, we've got our two systems here. So we've got our spheres base system, which has got our green base particles, and we have our system water, which is giving us our fluid and our foam particles. And it's looking good. Now we're going to move on and make our hero splash, which is a really important part of this animation. It's the splash which will kind of come from behind and wrap around these green particles, and it'll be slowed down and remapped to almost a freeze frame, and then that'll be the start of our big explosion. So let's get all that sorted. First of all, before we do anything, let's just get organized and save up. So we'll go to File, Save Project As. Let's go to our parent waterspin folder, and we'll make a new folder. So we'll call this one 03. Let's call it Hero Splash. Oh, got a spelling mistake there. Let's... small p. Okay, good. And we'll go inside that folder. Let's hit another new folder, and we'll call this one cache, because we will be doing some caching, of course. And then let's rename this, and we'll call it 03 Hero Splash, and then give it a version. Excellent. Right, hit save. Right, we're ready to go. So before we actually move on to our new splash, there's a few things that we should probably do here to clean this thing up. Couple of things that I can see. First of all, we have got our fluid, and it's supposed to be kind of interacting with these underlying spheres. But you can see we've got a bit of a gap, really, where the fluid particles are interacting with the collider object. Now, they're not actually interacting with these spheres. They are interacting, if I open up my system water, they're interacting with this open VDB mesher, which is driving this collision deformer inside of the sphere. And it's this sphere that the fluid particles are interacting with. The sphere is being deformed by the collision deformer, and the collision deformer is being driven by this open VDB mesh of these base particles. But because this open VDB mesh, look, if I switch that on and off, you can see it's actually much bigger than those base particles. And as a result, the fluid particles aren't resting on the surface of the green particles. So we need to make some adjustments. So let's go to our mesher. And the reason that the mesher is bigger than the base particles is because the point radius is set to 1.5. So it's multiplying the particle radius by 1.5. So if we put this back down to 1, now you can see the particles that are still meshed are the same size as the mesher. But then we've lost some of the detail, and the reason we've lost some of it is because if I hit ND to show the lines, the polygon size is too big to be able to actually create any geometry around these particles, so it just disappears. So what we need to do is reduce the voxel size, which reduces the polygon size, which increases the polygon count. So let's just halve it, put it down to 2, and there we go. So the majority of them are now being meshed, and now this is a much closer representation of those underlying particles. So if I then make that invisible and make our sphere visible again, now this is much more accurate, but now we can't really see many blobs. Let's hit NA to get rid of the lines. We can't really see any blobs deforming it, so it looks like the collision former is not doing anything. And that's because the actual underlying particle spheres that are creating this open VDB mesh are being confined within a sphere of the same size using the collision object, so they never actually intersect it. So what we need to do is just make this sphere slightly smaller, okay? So if I just go back into my original spheres base system, this sphere, the sphere base inside, it is what is keeping the green particles from escaping, and this is 100 centimeters in radius. So what we want to do is make this sphere, which is the sphere water outside, this is colliding with the water particles, we just want to make it slightly smaller, which means that it'll start to bulge again with the underlying particles. There, can you see? Now we're getting the underlying particles deforming this sphere. So we've reduced it to 95 centimeters. So now when we rerun this sim, this fluid, the fluid particles and foam are going to much more tightly follow the surface of those, or look like they're following the surface of these particles. Great. So before we do run it again, there's just one more thing I'd like to do. I have a feeling that our sheeter, which is creating all of these new fluid particles, is a little bit too aggressive, and we're getting too many fluid particles as a result. And what we're missing are some nice kind of globby, thin tendrils. It's looking okay, but I think it could look slightly better. We'd see we're getting a big mass of particles down here. Now, I think we could improve this by just creating some thinner tendrils and not allowing these wider bodies of water to form. And the way we do that, let's go to the sheeter settings. The parameter that we're going to look at is this velocity alignment, which has an angle. So by default, this is on. And what it is saying is there's a bit of vector maths that's happening under the hood. But effectively what is happening is if the two fluid particles that Sheeter is analysing, if they're moving away from each other at an angle under 30 degrees, then they will be considered for sheeting. If they are moving away from each other at an angle greater than 30 degrees, they will not be considered for sheeting. So if we want to make thinner, more kind of thin tendrils and not spreaded out thin sheets, we could reduce this. So let's put it down to 20. And what this will do, it'll encourage longer, thinner lines. And so we're hoping that by the time the particles start moving up on the outside of these spheres, we get smaller, thinner little tendrils. And look, already this feels thinner here. Now, we could A/B this and do a hardware render, but we don't need to. Look, that is definitely a thinner sheet now. These are thinner tendrils. So that's working much better. Excellent. All right. And just finally, you don't actually have to do this step, but it just means that we're going to get a little bit of faster playback and a faster cache time, is we're going to put an age check on this sheeter. And all this is going to do is, let's just click it on, and we're going to put a max age of, say, 120. And all this is saying is a particle will only be considered for sheeting up to an age of 120, and then it won't be. And there's a variation either side. So there's a kind of a random variation. So it's anywhere between 90 frames and 150 because it's 30 frames either side of this number. And it just means that by the time we get to the end of the timeline here, where some of the particles have been around for a long time, it's not going to kind of just constantly been sheeting and multiplying and creating a huge amount of fluid particles. So the check age is a useful parameter to ensure your sheeter doesn't get out of control. Excellent. So let's just hit play. We'll run that through. And that's looking really nice. Our particles are far more close to the surface of our base spheres. It's going to look like they're interacting with it. That's working really nicely. We've got some nice thinner sheets for this kind of base fluid. And we're all ready for our, well, trying to sort out our hero splash, which is this splash which is going to curve around this and lead into our explosion. Excellent. So that's all looking really, really nice. So what we need to move on to now, we could actually tidy this up a little bit and get this working a bit more quickly by doing some caching. So that's what we'll do. So let's first of all look at what we have got. So if we go to our system base spheres, this is already cached, which is why it's working so quickly, which is great. So we can scrub through our green spheres very easily. What isn't cached at the moment are, well, we've got our emitter foam and our emitter water, that they're not cached, but also this collisions mesh. Oh, look, that's not spelt correctly. Let's change that straight away. I spelt collision incorrectly. Let's go to basic and add an L. What have we got? Let's just move that. We need 2 L's and 1 S. So collision mesh. Okay. Excellent, that's better. So this OpenVDB Mesher collision mesh isn't cached either. So we need to be quite canny about and organised about the way in which we do our caching at this point, because one of the key concepts of this animation, which is what makes it look so stunning, is the retiming of some cached particle simulations. And as a result, we need to be as organised as possible. So what we're able to do actually is we could move our OpenVDB Mesher collision mesh into our base spheres system. So let's do that. Let's take this and move it into the generators folder of, I'll just close that system down. So now we've moved that mesh into the system spheres base, okay? And now we can recache using this original cache object. And that means that when we come to cache our system water, it's just going to be caching the foam and the water, and we can then retime that without having to worry about retiming meshes that we don't want to retime. Great, so let's get this set up. So let's go to this cache. At the moment, this cache is red because it has cached these base spheres. Let's go to the Object tab. And we have already set our folder location to the appropriate folder. So let's do a couple of things. What we want to do now is we want to run this cache again, but we don't want to recache the base spheres. We want to leave them where they are, but we want to now include this collision mesh, and we don't want to cache all of the things in our system water. So what we can do is this. Let's just hold Control and Alt and hit the cross on our system water. And by doing that, what it does is deactivate all of those objects. So now everything within that system has been deactivated. Okay, so that's the first step. The next step, let's go to the cache object. And just to be doubly sure, let's just check only in same system. So it will only cache objects in this system. It's not going to try and cache anything in any other system. Okay, that looks good. So all we have to do now is hit build cache, and this is the important stage. Because we don't want to recache this base spheres, we want to leave that as it is, we want to hit continue. And by hitting continue, it will ignore this one and it will just mesh this one that hasn't got a cache. So let's hit continue. That's going to run through. So what I'll do will be pretty quick, but I'll pause it anyway, come back, and I'll tell you how long that took. Okay, so that just took just over 1.5 minutes to cache that. But look, now we have a red cache tag on our OpenVDB Mesher. So I can just make that visible, look. And then we can scrub through that. And now that is all cached. Good. So what you'll find now that we've cached this measure that we're just using as this reference object for our collision deformer, let's just minimize that. I'll hold Control Alt again and hit this cross, and it activates everything within our water system. So now you'll find that actually the simulation of the water, even though this isn't cached, the water in the spray isn't cached, but it'll run a lot more quickly because it isn't having to calculate that collision mesh. It's actually reading that from disk. So there we go, looking nice. We've got our water splashing over. That's looking really cool. Excellent. So now that we have done that cache, now we can look at caching our system water particles. So let's get that done. We can go to other objects, and let's go to the menu, bring in a cache object. And let's just rename this so we know what this is for. Cache water. Go to the Object tab. We're going to do external files. Let's get our file explorer. And we'll go to Libraries, Water Spin, Hero Splash, Cache. And hit OK. We'll put only in same system. So if we don't do only in same system and we run a cache, it will try and recache everything it can in system spheres base, and we don't want to do that. So it's a really important parameter to put. Only in same system, and it'll only try and cache cacheable objects within here. Okay, very nice. So that's looking good. Everything's set up. So we are ready to go. So yes, we can just build that cache. So we'll hit build cache, and I'll pause this, come back to you when it's done and let you know how long it took, and then we'll be able to scrub through our entire animation and get an idea of how it's looking. And there we are. That cache took 4 minutes and 15 seconds to complete. So now everything is running from cache, which means at this point, actually, because we're running from cache, just to scrub through, we can actually deactivate this collision mesh with the cache, because the particles have now been cached with a position, so there's no point in having to scrub through that mesh. And you can see, look, we can now scrub through this animation, and it's looking really cool. So we can scrub forward and back. Let's hit play. There comes our splash. We've got the fluid moving around, and you can really start to get a sense of what this is going to look like now. So that's really nice. Looking very cool. Pleased with that. So this is, remember, this is the base fluid animation here. So what we're going to actually get is actually quite a nice hero splash happening just by fluke, isn't there? But we're going to art direct and create our very own hero splash. And what we're going to go for is, this is going to be retimed, remember. And so around this area, if we look at the motion of our spheres, it's kind of coming in this way. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a hero splash that looks like it's coming from behind this side of the sphere, and it's going to go whoosh and splash up here, which we can then do kind of a nice slow motion on before the whole thing explodes. So that's going to look really nice, and everything's working fantastically well. Excellent. Very pleased with that. So let's do an incremental save on that, and then we can move on to start forming this hero splash. So what we're going to do is this. Let's take our system water, and we're going to duplicate this and borrow all of its settings to be the basis of our hero splash animation. So let's hit Control, and we will drag system water and let go, and it makes a copy. And this is going to be our new system for our splash. So we need to kind of rename it and make it and organize it up a bit. So we'll go to the basics and let's rename it, and we'll call it System Hero Splash. Let's go to the Object tab. We'll change the color to stay organized. There we go. Excellent. And we want it to be the same, only modifiers in the same system. So it's going to ignore all of the modifiers in our water and our spheres-based system. Very good. Let's just go inside it and make some changes to the objects that we need and get rid of the ones that we don't. So we're going to need an XP foam solver, a sheeter, and a FluidFX, as we did in the previous system. But we don't actually need this original flow field, because these splash particles are never going to go inside our collision sphere. So we can get rid of that original flow field. Let's just delete it out of our scene so we don't get confused. Very good. Let's delete our original cache object, which came in from our water system, because we'll do a new one for that as and when we need it. And we can delete these two cache tags on the two emitters, because again, we'll redo that when it comes to cache time anyway. Let's rename our emitters. We need two. We need a water one and a foam one, so that's handy. Let's rename this, and we'll go to the basic tab, and we will name this one Emitter Hero Foam. And let's go to the display tab, and we'll make that purple. There we go. And the water, we'll go to the basic tab, and we'll go Hero Water. Good. And in the display, we will change that icon color to horrible purple, and let's just change the particle color to the same. And that's just going to make it a bit obvious for us when we come to view it in the viewport, because it's going to be completely different. Excellent. So before we move on, let's do a couple of things. We'll take our emitter hero water. Let's just turn off the foam solve for now, because we don't need to do that just yet. And let's move it. So we don't want this emitter to be inside of our collision sphere. What we're going to do is this. We will have our water sim, and then at a certain frame, probably around here, maybe a bit later, probably frame 100, we're going to want this splash to emanate from here and whoosh, splash all the way across our spheres. So that's what we're going for. So we're going to fake that by introducing all of these new particles at that time from outside and behind the sphere. So we'll just kind of put it somewhere a little bit like that for now, but obviously we'll make adjustments when we need to. And this is going to be a much bigger emitter, something like that. Okay, very good. So a couple of things. What we need to do is, this is never going to go inside our initial particles. Now, remember, if we just go back to our system spheres base, we had our original base inside collider object, which is this sphere. And this is just to trap those initial green particles. It keeps the green particles inside. And what we had to do was we had to exclude the blue particles from this collider tag to get it to work properly. And we're going to have to do the same thing with our new emitters. So let's go to that collisions tab. And we go to the exclusions tab here. And look, do you remember we dragged in our emitter water and our emitter foam from this system? Well, we need to do the same thing with our new particles, which we renamed. So we need to bring in our emitter hero foam into this exclusions list, and our emitter hero water into this exclusions list. Okay, so that's that done. Excellent. Now at this point, let's take our system spheres base, and we're going to deactivate the whole system. So I'm holding Control and Alt, and we're just going to switch that off, because we don't need to look at that system just yet. Okay, so now this will run a little bit more quickly. And what we will do is, let's just hit play. So now we've got our cached blue particles and our live purple particles, and they're all become part of this same scene. So that's working quite nicely. What we can do, let's just go to our system water. This is cached, so none of this is being calculated now. It is all just reading the information from disk. But we do have one live object in here, which is this sphere water outside, and it has a collision tag on. Now, this collision tag will be affecting particles from our system hero splash, because even though in our system we've got only modifiers in the same system will affect these particles, but actually collision tags work across systems. So what we could do, because this is already cached, let's just switch off that collision and switch off that collision deformer. Okay, so now the only things that these two emitters are interacting with are the things in the same scene. So let's hit play. The blue and white particles here are cached, and the purple ones are live. Excellent. So there we could just look. Let's just switch off. Let's just switch off everything in our system water. So now we are just looking at our system hero splash, and there we can see it interacting with all of the various bits of geometry in the scene. Excellent. So it's kind of working at first, But then we're not really getting a coherent splash across here. It's all breaking up, and we want this to be a nice kind of body of water wrapping around this sphere. So what are we going to do to achieve that? Well, first of all, we need to control where they're moving. And we're going to do that using a flow field with a spline, which is going to give us really nice kind of precise art direction of these particles. So what we'll do is we're going to set up drawing a spline, we'll bring it into a flow field, and we'll start that process. So let's hit F5, and that brings our orthographic views up. We want to go to this top view because we're going to draw our spline again. So here we are in the top view. Here is our new emitter. So what we need to do is let's just make our sphere visible. So here is our collider sphere that the particles are going to be colliding with, this black outline. So let's go to our spline tool. And we want to be in Bezier mode, and we're going to draw probably just 3 points will probably do for this. So look, we'll go to where our emitter is, and let's draw a line in the direction we want the spline to go. Then we will come here and again draw a direction of the line, drag the spline out in the direction you want it to go. And again, the last one. So it's kind of wrapping around this sphere a little. Okay, we can go to this point. Let's just bring that handle in a bit. And this point, bring that handle in a bit. So there we have got our spline, which is wrapping around that sphere. Very nice. So let's hit F1 to go back to perspective view. I'll go back to my move tool, back to object mode. And then if we just orbit around, you can see, look, that spline is really nicely wrapping around that sphere. So that's working nicely. Right, so let's go back to point mode. Let's go to the move tool. What we want to do is we want our first point to be low down, kind of where the emitter is really, because what we want is we want these particles to start from kind of the bottom area of this sphere and wrap around and go diagonally upwards. So we'll bring that down like that. Okay, let's take our middle point. Let's bring this down too. And if you hold shift, you're able to move just one side of that Bezier line. Let's just maybe bring that down like this. Okay. And then let's take our final point and move this up because we want these kind of moving diagonally upwards. Let's hit this one and hit shift. We can just smoothen that out. And perhaps with this point, we can maybe move it across a little bit. And because we've done that, look, we've lost the line inside of our collision object. So let's just hold shift again and pull that handle out. So we can just push and pull really until we're getting a kind of a shape and a direction that we're pleased with. We can leave it at that for now. We can make further adjustments if necessary. Right, good. So let's go to our dynamics. So what we're going to do is we're going to put this spline within a flow field object to encourage these purple particles to move in this direction. So let's go to the dynamics menu of our system hero splash, and we will bring in a flow field. Now, by default, the flow field obviously is this force field, which is going to be forcing the particles in the +z direction. But if we change that default flow to a long spline, we can then drag in our new spline. So let's just make this spline a child of that flow field, just so we know where it is and it's kind of nice and organized in our system. And then let's drag the spline into the objects. All right. And we can see, let's just decrease the cell size. We get more, and you can see, look, now we've got this force field going around in the direction of that spline. Excellent. So we'll just increase that strength up to, say, I don't know, let's just try 75 as an arbitrary figure for now, which we can change if necessary. And then in the display of that flow field, let's just take off the show vectors so we're not seeing those arrows. So now those fluid particles are going much more in that. Look at that. Look how we've directed the flow of those particles more by having them follow that direction of the flow field. So that's working really well already. Excellent. Okay, let's go back into our production camera. So I think that we want this splash to perhaps start slightly lower in this scene. So let's just come out of the production camera. Let's go to the reverse. And what we could do, we could take our hero water emitter and just bring it down a little bit. And then we could take our spline in point mode, take that first point and just bring that down a little bit to follow. And then let's play again. Yeah, that's looking nice. So look, maybe we need this point to come down a little bit as well. Yeah, and then I'm going to hold shift to move that line in and down a bit. There we go. Let's try that. Yeah, that's looking nice. Excellent. Now, one thing we probably don't want these to be visible at the moment. So if you imagine when we have our animation going, just suddenly we're going to get particles appearing out of nowhere as they're emitted from this emitter. So we do really need to hide it. So let's address that with a couple more adjustments. So to do that, look, let's take our emitter hero water. Let's go to object mode. And let's hit the R for rotate tool, and let's just rotate it round to kind of follow the contours of that sphere. And then let's just move it. We'll go back to the production camera. Yeah, and then let's just move it up ever so slightly so it's out of the way. And come out of that camera and move back. So that's looking good. All right, and then let's go back to our spline, point mode, select this, and what I'm going to do is just move these Bezier points so that the flow is going down first. Let's move that up a bit so it's in the middle of the emitter. Down first before it comes up. Let's have a look at how that's looking. Yeah, so look, we're going to force these particles around. So let's have a look at how that looks. Yes, there's a really distinct splash moving across there. That's looking good. Right, we're getting there. So you can see, obviously, this is a push and pull exercise, but we've got huge amounts of control of how we make this look. I'm just going to make this emitter a little bit bigger. All right. Yeah, that's looking nice. Okay, so you make as many adjustments to that as you wish, obviously. But for me, I'm just about ready to stop. I'm just going to do one more. Let's just hold shift and bring in this so it more tightly hugs this line. And then I'll come out my production camera with this handle. I'm just going to hit shift and make this shorter. And then move that point a bit closer. Pull that in a bit. Right. Yeah, now I'm pleased. So that'll do. So what we'd like is a slightly larger body of water. We need a bit more sheeting going on here. So let's just go to, first of all, let's make a couple of adjustments to our hero water emission. We'll go to the emission tab, and we could perhaps increase that birth rate up to, say, 800. And let's sort out when these are being emitted. We don't want this splash immediately coming out. We want these to be emitted at around probably around frame 100 to 110. So let's change that to 110 start emit. Let's end emit on, say, frame 160. And we could put maybe a little bit of variation in the speed of those. So we have our initial fluid particles, and then we have got our nice pre-designed splash coming in. Very good. So then let's fill out this a little bit and have more particles. So the way we'll do that is in the sheeting. We can have different sheeter settings for these splash ones. And we don't want quite as thinner tendrils. We want more of a cohesive body of water. So to do that, there's a couple of things we can do. We can increase this velocity alignment angle. At the moment, only particles that are moving away from each other within 20 degrees of each other will sheet. Let's just put that up to 30, which means the tendrils will be slightly less thin. And then we can also, if we needs be, slightly thicker now, but also if needs be to thicken that up even more, look, we can increase this max hole size from 6, which is what we used in the previous system, the water system. Let's see if we get a more cohesive body, more filled out sheet. Yeah, look, that's working much better for our splash. Excellent. And what's great about this is that our flow field in direction mode is forcing the particles to follow the spline, but because it's in direction mode, we're still getting the effects of the turbulence and the gravity, which means that it still feels nice and splashy and coherent. It's not just religiously following the direction of this spline. So that's looking really nice. Excellent. So we're kind of there now. We just need to sort out getting this cached up, introducing our foam particles, and then we'll be there with this simulation. So that's what we'll work on now. So let's actually, there's one thing that we need to do here. If you remember, we have deactivated everything in our previous systems. So our system hero splash at the moment is working as a purely isolated system, which is fine. However, there is one thing that isn't working correctly just yet, and this will become obvious if I reactivate my system water to see the previously cached particles, and let's switch on our hero foam, and let's just get this running. What you're going to notice is our splash particles don't quite sit right with our underlying. Can you see it looks like they're going underneath our cached fluid particles? And if this was working exactly how we wanted it, they wouldn't be sitting underneath. Let's just make that sphere invisible. And we'll make our system water sphere invisible as well. Okay, this is cached, so we don't need these ones activated. Okay, so it looks like our new uncached splash particles are going underneath this. And that is because if you go to our sphere water outside, everything is activated, but our collision deformer is referencing our collision mesh. And the collision mesh is in our system base system, and it is deactivated. Look, we deactivated it. So we're not actually getting the same collisions on this sphere with the purple particles as we are with our cached blue ones. So what we need to do is we need to activate this cached open VDB. Let's activate the cache object as well, and this cached mesh. We don't need to see it, but it has to be active, otherwise it's not going to work inside of our hero splash collider object. So let's do that, and we can also activate our base spheres so we can see those. And we're seeing our flow field object. So what we need to do is go back to our sister water. Now we're looking at this flow field object, which we don't want to see. In fact, we can deactivate all of these dynamic objects because remember, this is cached, so we don't have to have any of those active. Let's deactivate those. So now we should be running correctly. The green particles are cached. The blue water particles with foam are cached. The purple particles are live, and they should be colliding correctly with that sphere which is being deformed with that collision deformer. So you see it's running a lot more slowly now because that collision deformer is reading that open VDB mesh which we reactivated. So it's running more slowly, but what you're going to see is when our splash particles come round, they're going to be interacting correctly with the underlying collider, which means they'll feel much more coherent with our splash particles. And you can see straight away they look much better. They look part of the same sim now. Excellent. So we'll just leave this going along. Let's see how this looks. And we've got this fantastic splash moving along in exactly the way we want it. We can make adjustments to this by just altering the spline. You can bring in multiple splines into that flow field and it's going to work. And you can do whatever you want with it. But now we have art directed this rotational splash. Fantastic. We are getting ever closer. Excellent. So that is sorted. I'm happy with that. Now what we need to do finally is cache out our system hero system, so everything is cached to disk, and we'll be ready to move forward to the next stage. So let's take our system hero splash, and we are going to go to other objects, and we're going to bring in an XP cache. Let's just rename this cache hero. Right. So the cache object, very important at this stage that we check only in same system. So it's not going to try and cache again all of the objects in these other systems. So that's a really important box to tick. Excellent. So now we're going to go to, we want it to cache to external files. So let's take our folder. We need to go to our File Explorer. Let's go to our libraries, water spin, hero splash, cache object. So these are the emitters that we've already cached prior, but we're going to select this parent folder, hit OK, and we're ready to go. So let's hit build cache. So I'll pause this here. I'll come back when it's finished, let you know how long it took, and we'll play through and see how it looks. Okay, so that took 10 minutes to complete, and it's 6.5 gig, that cache. So a lot of kind of foam particles in there. So just before we do the playback, let's just go to our system spheres base, and let's just switch off our OpenVDB collision mesh, because there's no need for us to have to read through this whilst we're scrubbing through the other particles. That's done its job now. We no longer need it, so there's no point while we're playing back to be reading that cache data as well. So if we hit play, here's our animation, and here come our splash particles. Perfect. And then by this kind of frame, this will have been freeze framed by about here, and then we come on to our actual explosion. And of course, there's lots of retiming to be done. This isn't how it's going to look finally, but you can see we've managed to get our base particles. We've got a really kind of coherent base fluid particles going underneath, and then when we want it, we've got a much more art-directed splash, which look is following. We can see the spline following that spline perfectly, and it all looks coherent, part of the same system. That is looking fantastic. Excellent. So let's get that saved up, and then we can finish this video and move on to the next. And the next video is arguably one of the most important for this entire series, because we're going to learn and work through a technique which will enable us to retime these caches, these cached particles, into a stunning animation. So that's what we're going to look at next. We're going to be retiming these caches using a pretty neat technique. That's coming up in the next video.